or would it mess things up?
Good morning. You can do better than that. Good morning.
Good morning.
Good job. So I'm Rod Howe. I am Assistant Director for Cornell Cooperative Extension and Executive Director of CARDI, which is the Community and Regional Development Institute. Since I have two hats, I just want to say I hope that you all work closely with your Cornell Cooperative Extension associations. And if you don't have a relationship wherever you sit in the state with your county association, please reach out and get to know them. I know we have some Cornell Cooperative Extension folks here today. So there's that. And CARDI, I hope that you all know CARDI. If you don't, please do check out our website. It's www.cardi.cornell.edu. I think it's on some of your materials, so you don't need to capture it right now. We believe strongly in supporting, sort of our tagline is informed decision making. So we like to support officials to make informed decisions using data, using research, thinking about the kind of venues that need to be created to have dialogue about the complex issues facing our communities. So if you don't receive our electronic newsletter, send us an email and we'll make sure you get the CARDI communique. It comes out once a month. But do check out our website as well for information. Today's agenda is really about common ground. We know that in this period of fiscal stress that we all want to make sure that we have efficient local government, that we are providing quality services to our constituents. So this is really a chance to dialogue about the challenges we're facing to do some of that collaboratively. We have multiple partners, but CARDI is very pleased to be hosting this with the Fiscal Policy Institute, and you'll hear from Fred Floss next. It's been an opportunity for us to work actually with a broad set of partners, many of the MICs, the Municipal Information Exchange partners, and other union partners. We're very pleased that the New York State United Teachers is supporting financially the conference, so thank you to NYSET for that. Special thank you to Professor Mildred Warner and all her students, who really, in some regards, were the intellectual energy behind this. So would all of the students stand up, and let's thank them. And Mildred's already standing up over here, so thank you very much. And Pete Savage and Jim Larson from NYSET have really done yeoman's work putting this together, so if they would also stand up so we can recognize them. We want you to actively participate in many ways. Fred will talk about that, but there is a Twitter feed, which I think you'll see up on the screen here in a few minutes. So Twitter throughout the day. How many of you use Twitter? Okay, good. So we should have lots of tweets throughout the day today. There will be a conference evaluation either sent out at the end of the day or tomorrow morning. It's an electronic evaluation, so please do take time to fill that out. This is another event in a series of events looking at the state of our cities, municipalities of upstate New York, so it's an ongoing process, and we want your input to help guide what comes after this. We will be collecting notes from today. We'll put together some sort of briefing. I assume you've all checked out the robust resources posted on the CARTI website. If you haven't had a chance, make sure you go to the CARTI website and look at the materials. There's some handouts on the table. If you didn't grab them coming in, they will be there during the day. Let's see. And hopefully the weather will be totally fine. You can just relax during the day and stay for the social gathering at the end after the final panel, where we have some folks who will be talking about next steps and providing some reflections on the day. So thank you all very, very much for being with us today. We look forward to the conversation, and with that, I'll turn it over to Fred.
I'd like to say welcome too. My name's Fred Floss. I'm a senior fellow at the Fiscal Policy Institute and working with Cornell and CARTI to put together today's event. I'd like to recognize and thank Ron Deutsch, our new executive director for the Fiscal Policy Institute. So if you have any issues and questions, you can talk to Ron. The important part about today's conference, and I think the reason that both CARTI and FPI were so interested in putting together this conference, is that it brings together both state, local, and regional elected officials. It brings together unions. It brings together academics. It brings together community leaders to be able to have a dialogue before the crazy season starts. That's why we picked now. And to be able to start to talk about what real solutions are together. Because I think all too often we only meet when there are difficulties and times that are tough, and it's hard to come to agreement. So hopefully this will be something that we do on a more regular basis, and that we start to have that dialogue that's so important if we're going to find solutions to our problems. And I know that everybody here today wants to find those solutions. The other thing that we want to say today is that this is an interactive program. We expect you to do more work than we do up here. So we expect questions, we expect discussion, we expect examples, and if we say something, we expect you to challenge it. Everybody is going to have a different perspective, and all those perspectives are very, very important. And if we're going to be honest and work through and come up with true solutions that are going to last, that's the only way we're going to be able to do it. So hopefully today we will have a wonderful time, and hopefully you won't beat up because the students are here, so you'll show your best behavior, so that will be good. What I'd like to do now is introduce Paul Sawyerville from Malta for some welcoming remarks. Paul?
Although I'm supervisor for the town of Malta, I have the honor this year of being chairman of the County Board of Supervisors. And they gave me free rein to say whatever I wanted to about my bio. But I would like to point out that when I graduated from college a few years ago, I was trained as a civil engineer, and my goal was to build dams all across the state of New York. I can tell you, I learned quickly that having a transit and all of the information that I needed from tech school, University of Vermont, wasn't enough, because the first thing I faced was the need for a benefit cost ratio. And didn't appreciate that at the time so much, but over the course of my career, I've learned how important it is to justify and to have a positive benefit cost ratio as you move forward. It came into play very handily here 2 years ago when Saratoga County faced some fiscal stress. We were rated by the controller as moderately stressed. We didn't want to raise taxes, so we went about to try to improve our efficiencies and reduce our stress rating that way by finding alternative insurance companies, by looking at staff and eliminating positions that weren't necessary, by selling surplus property that was a burden on the taxpayer. And I'm pleased to say that by applying data-driven decision-making at the Saratoga County, we were successful in accomplishing our goal. I wanted to point out in today's paper, I don't know who orchestrated this, but there was an editorial on the very topic that you're going to be talking about over the next day or two. It's titled, "In Politics, Does Evidence Matter?" And they talked a little bit about a new commission that's being considered called the Murray-Ryan Bill, which would create a 15-member commission at the federal level to begin to look at data and how it can be used for better decision-making. After all, we owe that to our citizens and our country. So I want to point that out, that is something that might happen over the next year or two if there is support for that kind of study. Also wanted to point out, for those of you that have not completed your Christmas list, they made reference to an interesting book by Haskin and Margulies, and it's called Show Me the Evidence is the name of that. So if you're looking for an item to put in your stocking, Show Me the Evidence might be a good document to ask for. With all of that said, I'm here to welcome you to Saratoga County, and I hope that the weather breaks so that you can get a safe trip home. I want to thank you all for the few minutes that I've had to say a word or two about the importance of data-driven decision-making. Thank you.
And for a few more welcoming remarks, Joanne Yepsen from Saratoga Springs.
Good morning. Thank you so much for having me. I'm the mayor of Saratoga Springs and have been serving in that capacity since January 1st. Before then, I served on the County Board of Supervisors with Paul Sawsville, representing Saratoga Springs as a city on the County Board of Supervisors for 8 years. So I've had the county perspective, the frustrations with the state, and now as a mayor in this wonderful Empire State of dealing with all the fiscal stress and the fiscal realities. I just came from another conference where I recognized the importance of economic development through the creative process, and it's called Creative Economy. And there's an alliance building in this region through 8 counties to create a real creative hub for economic development purposes. To that end, I have just released an announcement that I've put together a commission on the arts for Saratoga Springs because we need to find new and important ways to market ourselves. We're not just getting checks anymore from the state. In fact, they're looking to have us pay their bills, as you know. So this is a reality ever since the recession hit in 2008. We also had some layoffs way back in 2009, which we're still recouping from. But clearly, we all have to think more creatively on how to fund the important local services and the local programs that our constituents have not only grown to expect, but need. And there's everything in this city from a Code Blue shelter to coming up with working with top CEO executives to ensure that we're bringing the best and the brightest to the city and to the county, especially young professionals, and that's going to really help for our future to be successful. And clearly we can't do that without all of you and your intellectual capital. I think people always say to me, what was the one thing that really surprised you when you became mayor? And I knew our community was talented, but the talent is coming out of the woodwork, and I am just thrilled that more and more people are moving to this area and to the city and offering their services to the city. The only way we're going to be successful in this economy right now, until things change, and I do not see them changing in the near future, is to create these public-private partnerships. We hear about that all the time, right? And it's kind of a buzz phrase, but it really works. And I've had many examples where intellectual capital has come forward, created an idea, and the city has partnered with that idea, and it's working. So although we are not letting our Albany legislators off the hook, we're going to be lobbying again next year for some revenue lines that we've counted on in the city, and we're going to continue to do that. But clearly we've had not only property tax cap that has put some strain on many communities. Luckily, Saratoga Springs has had enough revenue with sales tax revenue, occupancy tax revenue, and VLT revenue to continue to stay within that 2% property tax cap without any cut in services. However, we're always looking for ways to partner with our local neighbors or become more efficient within our own boundaries. We're doing more all the time with big decisions to how to better use our resources. And clearly, one of the most powerful tools we have in an ongoing quest to be more effective and efficient are conferences like these, because they're exchange of ideas, innovative outside-the-box thinking, and a willingness to learn from each other's mistakes. So I am really dedicated to working with all of you and see public service and what you do as very similar. And I think the sooner we begin to strategize and plan and look at creative ways to run our cities and to be efficient and effective, the better. So I'm thrilled to be here, have a great conference, and again, I think the weather is the county's fault, really, but I'll take a little responsibility. I suppose I hear the schools just closed, so you need to just enjoy yourself, stay safe here, and just have a great day and a great day of exchange and creative thinking. So thank you, and I want to thank Ron Deutsch in particular. I'm also going to be going to him and asking him to solve all my problems as well. So thanks, Ron, for including me today to begin to have that conversation. Have a great conference.
So thank you all. We're going to jump right into the first presentation. So my colleagues, Robin Blakely Armitage.
Can I say something? Is it too early for comments as you're encouraging?
Not at all.
Okay, I would like to, I'm Therese from CSCA, and we've been fighting to keep the Maplewood Manor Nursing Home open, and the Saratoga County Board of Supervisors made a decision to sell it to a private corporation, and this week we're seeing in the media the result of that sale, which as predicted is a 25% staff being laid off and up to 50% reduction in salary. These are people that work in Saratoga County, in Ballston Spa, whose lives, as well as the lives of the residents living there, will be forever changed by the decision of the Saratoga County Board of Supervisors. Mayor Yepsen did not, I just want it finished. Mayor Yepsen, thank you. No, I just want to thank her for her vote. She voted against it.
Okay.
Thank you,
Great.
Mayor Yepsen.
Okay, good. But that's the kind of issues that need to be raised today, so thanks very much. So with that, we're going to turn over to Robin Blakely Armitage and David Kay, who are going to jump right into data, social indicators, and continuing the dialogue. So I was teasing Robin a little bit about the snowflakes, but I guess it's appropriate to have snowflakes on the slide today.
Thank you all for coming. So I am Robin Blakely Armitage. I'm a Senior Extension Associate with CARDI. I'll introduce my fellow panelists and the discussants right now. So this is David Kay, who's also a Senior Extension Associate in CARDI. We'll have John Sipple, who's Professor in Development Sociology, and then our discussants today will be Mac Cook, who's a City Manager in the City of Cortland, and Janet Mayo with the New York State Office of the Comptroller. So thank you to our discussants. So I was really pleased to hear about data-driven and evidence-based decision-making, because that's what we're all about at CARDI. Today we're going to talk about decision-making for quality services, information indicators, and dialogue. Whoops, how do we?
Use this, or you can go with this.
That's what I tried to do. A little technical issue.
So you're
No.
Why is it changing here?
I don't know. Maybe put go to slideshow. Sorry about this.
It worked 10 minutes ago. Okay. Any techies in the house?
There's somebody coming to our rescue.
I have an issue with the.
Maybe we should close it and just start it over.
Yeah, there it goes. Cool.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so the overview of today's presentation, why indicators? I don't think it's going to be a tough sell after that introduction earlier. We'll spend a little time on that. We will talk about trends in New York State local government spending as sort of the backdrop for using indicators. We'll spend a little time on examples of indicator projects that support informed decision-making about government service provision, and then measuring impact with indicators. So why are we talking about indicators? Well, we're talking about fiscal stress. We're all concerned about fiscal stress that necessitates changes in funding. But what about the impacts? We all know that we have to change some things to address our fiscal stress, but there are a lot of conflicting opinions about what the impacts of these decisions would be. Informed decision-making means including a consideration of the consequences and the impacts of these decisions. So oftentimes that sort of gets missed in the conversation, or there's a lot of confusion about how to measure these things. So how to measure impacts. We'll talk about the role of data and other indicators, and how to connect indicators to actual decision making, how to put them into practice, how to put them into action. And what we'd really like to do is also hear from you at the end of this presentation about how you're using data and indicators, and if you're using data and indicators in your decision making processes and thinking about impacts of your decisions. So with that, I'll turn it over to David.
Thanks, Robin. And remember, you're going to give me a 2-minute warning, so I don't take too much time. So I'm going to start with just kind of a little taste of data wonkery by looking at a couple of recent trends. We have a lot more data that we're not going to show to feed those of you who really believe in the supervisor's admonition to use data in your decision making. What I'm going to just show you very briefly is based on the comptroller's database, which many of us have used, some trends just for counties and towns, just because they're very different kinds of municipalities, to give you a little flavor of things. I'm going to just show trends compared to inflation, where the inflation index I'm using is actually a government. It's not the general inflation indicator, it's a cost of government index. And I'm going to focus primarily on areas of major spending, which I'm defining major spending as being accounting for 10% or more of the budgets of these of counties and towns. And the question is that I was looking at was basically what's growing, basically kept up with inflation versus not kept up with inflation. So here's a summary for counties. And what we see is the percentages in yellow on the side are basically the proportion of the budget in one of the years we looked at, and whether or not it kept up with inflation or not. And the bottom line that you'll see there is that the only area of spending which exceeded inflation is employee benefits in terms of these major areas. So we're spending less in terms of real dollars in all of these other important areas that account for large portions of county budgets. We're spending more in employee benefits, which I think you intuitively will understand does not directly translate into, even though we're spending more, it doesn't directly translate into service provision increases. Total expenditures by counties have also not kept up with inflation. And here's just one of many charts that we have kind of showing this by service area. The point here again, emphasizing the dark dotted line is again the inflation trends, and the other, so if you see the lines going above that, it means that their spending has increased more than inflation, and if it's below that, as is true for total expenditures, it's grown by less than inflation. So you can't exactly necessarily translate that into fiscal efficiencies per se, but you do see that overall spending is growing less than inflation by counties. How about for towns, just as a comparison? Same basic idea. In terms of these service areas, what we're seeing here is the major areas, again, being transportation, employee benefits, general government, public safety, and sanitation. That public safety basically is the only direct service provision area where major area where spending has kept up with inflation. Again, employee benefits greater than inflation, and all the rest of these major areas have not kept up. And indeed, as I'll show in a second, spending on general government has actually declined in absolute terms, not just in relation to inflation. So the central core processes of running a government spending has gone down in towns. And total expenditures have gone down relative to inflation. So this is just a chart that shows this, the transportation line basically keeping up with inflation pretty closely. The public safety expenditures, not quite, but almost. And then the general government expenditures actually declining absolutely relative to what they were at the beginning of the recession. 2007 was the base year. What I want to move into next is talking about some community indicator projects, because community indicators is one form of data at the community level that have been used empirically in the real world to support informed decision making in various parts of the country. These are just examples of ways that data can be used, as the chair of the Board of Supervisors suggested, to inform decision making at the local level. And I want to point out that these particular indicators are on a pretty useful website, and in a part of the website that focuses on something that I think is perhaps also a little technical, but I think very important, which is thinking how does the idea of general community quality of life and other kinds of general community indicators, how can they be married with performance measurement indicators, where performance measurement indicators are much more focused on how government is doing and how well it's doing its job, and how the performance of government therefore relates to the broader issue of quality of life in the communities we live in. 5 minutes. Thank you. So I'm not going to go into this one very much, but I wanted to pick, if you remember, some of the areas of decline in county service provision were, among them was social services. So I wanted to throw up one example of a county that was using indicators to look at trends in social services. This is Broward County, Florida, focused on children, and I want to highlight the fact that they have tied their use of indicators back to a strategic plan. at least they claim, that it's really working to help improve quality of life in indicators. I haven't evaluated that myself, but I believe it. And that they use this concept of results-based accountability, using data to collectively take action to improve the lives of children, family, and the community. A lot of interesting stuff there. I don't have time to go into that. I wanted to focus on a New York example next, which also some of the students have used in their presentations later today. And that is the Rochester ACT Community Indicators Project. And in this case, I want to focus on another area which there was different performance at the county level, and that's over there on the right, the public safety indicators. And as we go on and look at that, what you can see on this website is within this area of public safety, they have a number of indicators that they're looking at. And the one, I'm only going to look at one indicator right now, which is crime rates. But they also have, you know, on this website, they look at trends, they look at policy responses and activities, they look at other resources related to public safety, and they look at other indicators in their database that are related. So on to crime for a second. This is their catalog of crime indicators, and we're going to focus on violent crime. And as you can see, there's a pretty, you know, they're showing trend data, they're comparing the regional data to state, national, sub-regional data. They have interpretation, which I'm not showing over there, under analysis of what the data mean, and they have the raw data behind it. And perhaps most important, they have this whole section about what's being done to make transparent to the public what's being done in response to trends in crime. I wanted to show one other example of a community indicator project that tries to combine community indicators with government performance measurement. And this is from Truckee, California, Washoe County, and you can see on the left that they've had a long-term quality, you probably can't read that, quality of life indicators today project with a whole slew of indicators with various stakeholder groups in the community buying into sort of, if you will, shepherding or monitoring, adopting those indicators to sort of see what's going on. But I wanted to draw attention at this point to the fact that the Board of County Commissioners has adopted themselves 5 of those indicators as a legislature to pay particular attention to those, and that if you see over there on the left, what they do is they really have a plan of how the county legislature will use the indicators to translate what they're seeing into policy responses. And you can kind of look at that and see, you know, what they've formally committed themselves to doing in terms of using indicators in their policy process. Good. I'm almost done. I might be even ahead of time. So this very complex looking chart is something where I wanted to finish in this last section just by talking about the idea of how do you build a bridge between the idea of sort of broad sets of community well-being indicators and performance indicators and funding for government activities. And one of the ways to do that is to think about what people call a logic model, which is really just a sort of logical chain of cause and effect based on the idea of if we make a change in spending in a given spending area, a given service area, what do we think is going to happen? Once we think about what's going to happen, and that's kind of what this flow chart shows for this particular government situation, which is looking at crime prevention programming. They're saying, given what we're doing, what do we expect the consequences to be? And then what you can go through, and that's what those arrows on the right are supposed to be about, is saying, given those consequences, what kind of indicators do we think we'll be able to measure at reasonable cost that will be able to tell us what's going on? So I don't think I have time to really talk more in detail about it, but the fundamental point is you kind of have to have a theoretical model, which is really just a practical model of what's going to happen if I do this, in order to decide what it is that you want to look at to try and measure before you invest in a measurement program. And you can see on the left, the idea behind a logic model is kind of dividing things up into into intermediate, immediate, long-term kinds of consequences. If you can't see any changes in those indicators as a result of what you're doing, you either have to conclude that your indicators aren't very good or that maybe your logic about what's going to happen isn't very good. And I think that's it, right? We're going to have John come up now. Are we seeing anything up there? Okay.
Well done. Thank you. Thank you all for being here. Thanks, David and Robin. I did want to, we forgot a little hashtag on the opening slide. And the hashtag for today, if you don't know what that means, don't worry about it. If you do know what it means, it's Solve Fiscal NYS. Hashtag Solve Fiscal NYS is the hashtag for today. Again, if you don't know what that means, don't sweat it. All right. Ooh, sorry about our covering up our title there. I was asked to speak about kind of the school version of this in this broader context of trying to understand the relationship between paying attention to the dollars, the revenues and expenditures, and really trying to balance budgets with what it means in terms of programmatic offerings. And so I have this title, which you can't see. Sorry about that. Must have been the invisible hashtags earlier. The Trading Financial Insolvency for Educational Insolvency, a Hypothesis. So this notion, I'm going to have a couple concepts that we're going to compare and contrast and try to look at some data with this basic notion that David and Robin were pitching here, in that we should really think about what are some indicators that we want to pay attention to at the local level so we can see what the impact of our local decisions, our state decisions are when we think they're related to dollars, but we clearly then showed how it rolls out in program. So financial insolvency, we kind of know what this means. And it's pretty simply put, is that when your revenues are unable to meet your obligations. Okay, and it's pretty clean and pretty clear. This notion of educational insolvency, though, this first came up for me when I was invited to give a talk that was about a year and a half ago now, it's quite a while ago, by Carl Hayden, who's the former chair of the Board of Regents, and now at the Rockefeller Institute in Albany. And he called me up and asked me to give a talk at the Rockefeller Institute about this concept of educational insolvency. And I said to him, what do you mean by that, educational insolvency? He said, I don't know, that's why I'm calling you to tell us about that. So I gave it some thought and gave a talk and put together some materials and so forth. I'm not going to give you the entire talk here. We can do that elsewhere at a different time if you're interested. But this notion here is a pretty soft and fuzzy term, educational insolvency. And it's I call it a relative term, and it's depending on what we are trying to accomplish. What are we actually trying to invest our $60 billion a year in local, state, and federal dollars here in New York State, and the $600 billion a year across the country in our educational system. But we find ourselves in what I call the big squeeze. And the big squeeze is what you're well versed in this, and whether you're related to a school or to a municipal government. But particularly in relation to school, this increased unit cost that we have. The dollars expended per student has just been going up and up and up, and a variety of reasons for that. Not the least of which, because what we often talk about is healthcare expenditures, which are going up, retirement costs, which are going up. But what's not often talked about is this, and this is kind of the reality of what schools are facing in most areas around the state. And this is your demographic change, okay? Where by and large, particularly in the more rural areas, although quite a bit in the urban areas, the demographics are getting poorer. The students are getting poorer. There's greater proportions of minority students, greater proportions of English as a second language or ESL students. Special education rates are slowly going up. And what's important about each of these is for a whole variety of reasons that we can talk about, they're more expensive. These are students who are more expensive to teach than other students. Okay? So your unit costs, in addition to healthcare and retirement and other issues, these are issues that are driving up the unit cost. On the flip side, we have all these constraints. Okay, and you're well versed in this. You don't need me to go through this list here. We've had plenty of these conversations over the last 3, 4, 5 years. Okay, but as a result of that, our revenues are constrained. Our expenditures are, in a sense, necessarily going up. And how do we balance this? How do we think about this? So if we look at one version of this, prior to the Great Recession there, we see this upward movement. This is the percent of revenues from the state that make up local school budgets. It's broken up by different types of districts. So you have, this is really, really hard to see. New York City is the blue line, the big four is the red line, way up top. The low-need districts are the orangish line on the bottom, and so forth. The high-need rurals are the purple line. And what you see across the board, right before the recession hit, was this upward movement in the percent of revenues from the state. There's the court case, the CFE case that was driving more revenues, or driving more expenditures, or more dollars, I should say, to these school districts for a whole variety of reasons. And then, of course, with the recession, the state peeled back. And so the proportion of spending in a local budget was shrinking from the state level to the point where it's about 38% if you include STAR and drops a little lower if you don't. And there's only the vast majority of states across the country have a much larger proportion of state support than we do have here in New York State. And this, of course, has been trending in this other direction. Okay. Another thing that's been going on over time, this is the assessed property value per pupil. So this is the ability of a locality to levy taxes to pay for its schooling. Okay, and what you see are some parallel lines. You see the red line, which are the low-need districts, at about $1 million, slightly under $1 million of a taxable property value per pupil. And then all the others are down somewhere in the 200 to 400,000 range. And as we got from 2002 right up through the recession, the wealthy areas developed an incredible amount of wealth per pupil that you could tax, and the others were pretty flat. Okay, so this issue of the inequality comes out. Okay, fund balance, you can see where the fund balance is being socked away, saving for a rainy day. Governor called this, the school districts are holding onto too much of the public's money, called for the tax cap, and so forth. And then you see the recession, we started spending down our fund balances to try to protect the programs. And then notice at the end there, the fund balance is coming back a little bit. Okay, there's a website. I'm not going to do this. Robin would kill me right now if I clicked on that link. I'm not going to do it. But if you want to click on the link, you're more than welcome. A whole set of data tools where you can look at all kinds of different financial and demographic indicators for school districts and/or counties there. What I'm going to show you real quickly is this goes back a few years, about a decade and a half. Each of those little shapes are school districts in New York State. The dark green ones are where the 3-year enrollment change was up about 10%, at least 10%, and the dark red ones where it decreased about 10%, and the yellows were kind of neutral, kind of level enrollment over simply a 3-year period. And this, again, goes back to the mid-90s. And I'm going to hit the button, and you're going to see the more recent data, okay? And you see a lot of red. These are a lot of districts who are averaging over 10% drop in enrollment over just a 3-year period. So this notion of these indicators of what we're paying attention to as far as the economic health of a community, ability to pay for its program, who we're serving and so forth, we see this incredible hollowing out, if you will, of some population. All right? And so we get insolvency. We have financial insolvency where the fund balance is gone, obligations exceed revenues. Educational insolvency where the quality of the educational opportunity outcomes are become unacceptable. And we thought we were going to see this. We really thought we were going to see a number of school districts going bankrupt over the last 2, 3, 4 years. Every year we had this conversation. Is it going to be 2? Is it going to be 5? Is it going to be 20? We haven't seen one, not one. Okay? And we're worried this is happening. We're worried we're carving out so much of the program so that the school districts maintain their budgets, make sure that their expenditures don't exceed their revenues, that we fear that we're heading towards this great educational insolvency. Real quick, okay? Professor Warner and I, Mildred and I, had done this statewide study on shared municipal services and shared school district services, and we have some indicators real quick on these would indicate fiscal insolvency. You know, this kind of work here, considering bankruptcy, exploring consolidation, selling off assets, exhausting the fund balance, are indicators of fiscal insolvency. What are indicators of educational insolvency? Well, personnel cuts, increased user fees, eliminate services, and reduction in services. And so what happened in terms of the self-reports coming back from the field around the state is a whole lot more of the educational insolvency indicators were taking place than were the financial insolvency indicators. So we have this great concern that while we haven't had anybody go bankrupt, there's a huge cost to that, not in terms of dollars, but in terms of program. And so one thing I'm trying to push here this morning is that this cost of program, okay, are where these different types of indicators, not the financial indicators, but the programmatic indicators are what we need to talk about. So with that, I will stop. I'll leave that up there just for perusal, and then we still have enough time for our discussants. Thank you.
John left it up, and I'm going to take it down.
Actually, while we get the next slide up, maybe Mac and Janet could come up, and I just have a couple more things to say. But why don't you come on up? And 'cause we're squeezed for time this morning, so. Sure. You have a seat. Okay, so one last thing I wanted to say was, while I'm sure you're all sitting on the edge of your seats waiting to hear about the next great project that Cornell University is engaged in, I think what David's been talking about, obviously we have state level constraints, but there's local realities that vary tremendously across these municipalities in New York State. And so the question is, when you're just having decision making at the local level in the context of fiscal stress, the impacts, if you're concerned about impacts and measuring impacts and using data and indicators to measure impacts, those are going to vary due to your demographic changes, other contextual factors, and different needs too of your population. So what we're hoping to do over the next 3 years is actually look at a community-driven indicator model that we can develop a process that localities can incorporate for themselves that looks at some of the impacts that are being felt in particular communities and operationalize some of those impacts so that communities can start to form a more robust, if not statistically rigorous, way to analyze what are the impacts of our decisions. So we hope that this will really contribute to decision making that gets us closer to answering that question, if we cut this service, what is really going to happen? And not just in the short term, but is this going to be even more costly in the long term because of unforeseen consequences? So we're hoping to use local informants, service stakeholders, interviews to help identify what key indicators would be to track in particular localities. So stay tuned. We have a couple questions at the bottom of this slide. I'll leave it to the discussants whether or not they want to address those questions, but if we have time, a few minutes for dialogue at the end of the session, maybe we can open it up. And essentially it's what methods are you currently using to estimate the impacts of your fiscal decisions, assuming you are using some sort of methodology or data or indicators? And do you think projects that link indicators to decision making have the potential to be useful? Why or why not? So just a little food for thought here. So I think we'll go to our discussants. Who'd like to go first?
Okay.
Ladies first.
Okay.
Janet, do you want to come up so they can hear you? Yeah. I think
Can you hear me?
they may need you for recording purposes.
I think so. Hello? Yes? Okay. Good morning, everybody. Thank you to Cardi and the Fiscal Policy Institute for having me come to be a discussant on a panel that is very near and dear to my heart. I am the manager of the Monitoring and Analysis Unit at the State Comptroller's Office, and for the past few years I have been working on a project to develop and roll out our fiscal stress monitoring system across the state. So we now issue fiscal stress scores and environmental stress scores for all cities, counties, towns, villages, and school districts on an annual basis.
So I've been working with indicators. I've been looking at fiscal stress for over a decade. We have, as this new initiative, though, has gone on now for the past 3 years. It took us about a year to develop the system, and we've been rolling now for about 2 years. And I wanted to just share with you some of my thoughts about indicators and how we develop them and use them, and just some of the things that we have learned as we've developed this system. The first thing, and the point was already made by the panel, is that you need to have a theoretical framework. You need to have some kind of framework to help you decide which indicators to pick. So without the framework, you don't really know what to pick. And the framework we used was one that was developed by the International City County Management Association on evaluating, it was a handbook on evaluating financial condition, and it provides a lot of different indicators, and this framework really is considered to be an industry standard. But the way it works is it views financial condition to be an outcome that results from what's going on in the local government's environment, as well as organizational factors and how the management of that organization responds to its environment. And so that suggests that we have 3 types of indicators. We have fiscal indicators, we have environmental indicators. These are the things that are really outside of local control, but they drive costs and they, could suggest revenue difficulties. And then we have management or organizational indicators. And when you're developing an indicator system, you have to think, okay, what can I measure and what can I not measure? And at the state level, we don't have a way to measure management and what's going on in the local environment, really. We have some environmental indicators that really kind of cover the state, but we don't have an indicator for that local situation that arose overnight that is going to strain your finances. Some of the devastating storms that we had is an example of that. We just can't have an indicator for that kind of thing. And so, choosing the number of indicators can be a challenge. You can't have hundreds of indicators either, right? It's easy to think, okay, well, to really capture what's going on in every locality, we need a whole bunch. But we have to keep it manageable so that each indicator on its own is meaningful. The other thing we learned is that each indicator on its own has limitations, right? For example, we have an indicator in our system of deficits, right? And so if you look at deficits on its own, you could think, well, deficits can be planned. Maybe we have fund balance and we're planning to spend it down, so we're going to have deficits. So deficits on its own, it has a limitation there. And so the temptation was, well, maybe we can make a more complicated calculation of that deficit indicator to try to capture unplanned deficits. But if you try to do that for every indicator, if you try to calculate in a way that addresses the limitation of each indicator, you'll have such complicated formulas for each one that it becomes unmanageable that way. So we had to rely on the use of multiple indicators. That, okay, if you have a problem with deficits on its own, maybe that isn't necessarily going to raise you to the level of being in fiscal stress. But if you have a negative fund balance and deficits and no cash, that pushes you up. So we rely on multiple indicators, and that's an important concept as well. We also have to think about who the consumers are for the information that we're putting out there. Is each indicator meaningful and understandable? Does it make sense on its face? Right? So these are all things that we had to think about. And of course, we didn't want to have to collect any additional data from our local governments. So even though we can't really measure certain things like organizational factors, it was tempting to think, well, we could add a schedule to their annual report and they could give us that information. But we did not do that because we didn't want to increase the burden on local governments. So the question that really we were asked here is, how can indicators be used for decision making? And I have some thoughts about how our indicators could be used. Number one, you can look at indicators to see, well, how are you doing? right? You can also do comparisons. So how are we doing compared to the rest of the state? How are we doing compared to similar places like us? So you can do peer group comparison and that kind of thing. The indicators provide data to substantiate what you already know, right? A lot of feedback we've gotten has been, well, we already know that. Well, yeah, you do already know that, but now you have data that supports what you already know, and so you can use that to really bolster your arguments when you're having discussions. Another way that it can be used at the local level is for gauging decision-making over time. So every local government is in some level, they have a financial condition that ranges from stress to good, right? And when you make decisions or things happen, maybe it pushes you towards fiscal health or maybe it pushes you towards fiscal stress. And so by looking at how things change over time, you can gauge the decision making that's being made at the local level. By having a fiscal stress score for all local governments in the state, we can also gauge decision making at the state level, right? So over time, this serves almost like a time series experiment. Well, we have this many places in fiscal stress, and then we enact some new statewide policy, and now that number either goes down or it goes up, right? So we can use that information to gauge how we're doing or at the state level with policies. We can also use the information, once it's consistently measured for all local governments, we can highlight common themes and common challenges and trends that we see around the state. And when we release the scores, we have released reports that point out some of these common themes and show what some of the challenges are being faced by local governments. And that information can be used also for decision making really at all levels. So it was a pleasure to be here to talk to you a little bit about indicators. It's great to see that people are using our data. We try to put out tools that are useful to help you in decision making. We have some tools that you can go in there and they're interactive. You can do what-if analysis and forecasts and that kind of thing. And I am interested to hear how the information is being used and also feedback if there's something that we could do to make that information that we put out more useful to what you're trying to do. Please let us know that as well. So thank you.
To all the students who are there, I look out there, you have your pens ready. I haven't said anything noteworthy in 35 years, and the chances of me saying something noteworthy in the next 5 minutes are pretty slim. So, pens down. Financial stress. I look back over the last 35 to 40 years that I've been in this business, and I don't know if there's financial stress. It's a term that's become very irrelevant to me. I don't know if we're any better or any worse. There always has been a limit on property tax. Now it's called a tax cap. We used to call it voters. Nothing's changed there. The state has never given up as much money, depending upon which side of the equation, which side of the aisle you're on, right? Either be it aid to municipalities or CHIPS funding. CHIPS funding is how we pave your roads. We're not doing a very good job on that right now. So that sales tax, we've always been dependent on it. What's changed now is that we are dangerously dependent upon a variable source of income to cover fixed cost. That's changed a little bit. Pension contributions, there was a slide. Yes, benefits are up. We've gone over the many years of having good periods of pension contributions to maybe not having so good periods. We're coming out of a couple last years where it's been stressful. We probably should come back into a cycle where it's not so stressful going forward. What am I getting at? I don't know if fiscal stress is the issue. I think it's demographic. We are demographically stressed. There is only so much that I can do as a small city of 19,000 people in central New York that had an industrial age, and now we're on a different era. I can beg and I can borrow and I can go to New York with my bonding agents and they're going to give me a bond rating based upon my fiscal, but I'm capped. I will never be an AA plus ratings because they're pinning at my demographics. And they're saying, that's holding you back. The fiscal stress monitoring, we've cleaned our house financially pretty well, but I'm always going to kind of be on that line because the environmental factors are against me. So what are we getting at? Local governments have to get in a mind that if we're going to change our financial model, we have to change our demographics. we've done is what we can do on our financial model. Okay. We share a lot of services. We used to call it just getting along with your neighbor and borrowing the backhoe when you needed it. Now there's a term for that. It's called share services. I'm so happy. But what's changed? I think the difference in financial makeup of local governments right now is that the lid is pretty tight. There's always been a lid, but the lid was softer. We used to have the resources to do a lot of different things at the same time. Meaning I could pave a park, I could build a park, I could pave a road, I could do things simultaneously now. Now the financial resources I can only do one thing at a time. And this comes into the cause and effect of why it's so important. Do I pave a park? Do I rebuild a park or do I pave a road? I can't do both anymore. Why am I doing something and what effect is it getting? Because our resources are so limited right now. We only have one bite at the apple anymore to be right, to change the demographics. And that's a little bit changed in the past. For example, the city of Cortland, once again, we're 19,000. We represent pretty much probably the prototype old industrial city. 65% of my taxpayers are 65 years older, or 65 years or older. And I'm moving close to dangerously close where 65% of my property tax base is tax exempt. I have an unemployment rate as of last month at about 9.6%. That's reported, the 9.6%. I think it's a lot higher than that. My median income is 18,000 people. 57% of my students in my elementary schools are on free and reduced lunch. How do I move those numbers? Where do I spend money to move those numbers? Part of our problem is no longer can I do everything. I do need that cause and effect. I need to find the triggers. I think it goes to that question, how do you estimate the impact of your financial? You have to look at the triggers that are going to move your demographics, because you only have X amount of dollars to spend, and those dollars are not reoccurring anymore. So I don't want to talk too long and leave it open for discussion at that point.
Any comments, questions? And
hi, Peter.
I'm not sure in terms of organization. I see a microphone. Do we need people to talk into the microphone or not?
Depends how loud they are.
Okay. Loud people, please. Go ahead. And if you could just introduce yourself briefly, that would be helpful too.
Hello, I'm a loud and reluctant I used to be a loud public servant in Buffalo. I was deputy county executive in Erie County for 8 years. And I want to suggest that everybody pay close attention to what the mayor of Portland had to say, because all of us who've been in public service and all of us who are in public service understand precisely that the two issues that you are talking about, that you addressed, are the critical issues. Number one, demographic change. Your school-age population, your star population, closely parallels all of the places in upstate New York that I've looked at. I've studied the school district in the city of Buffalo.
Can you go read
okay.
the microphone,
all right.
because of the recording that's happening?
Okay. The school district in the city of Buffalo, approximately 88% of the children in the school district are on farm, free and reduced lunch, free and reduced meals. The share of the county population is in that condition is growing. The number of food stamps went to, in my tenure as deputy county executive, from about 100,000 cases to about 150,000 cases. Suburbanization of poverty, low birth rate, loss in the baby birthing age cohorts, occurring at a time of, I don't know if it's a time of great narcissistic injury or just denial, but public officials are absolutely unwilling to think in terms of both the reality of demographic stasis and decline, and nobody wants to talk about restructuring. The best that we're going to get is a conversation about service sharing, and not the kind of restructuring that has taken place in Canada, in Britain, in Germany, and now even in France. So I'm very happy to be here, but I'm going to be a pest all day long. I'm going to be a pest all day long talking not only about the comfortable business of making nice arrangements across existing municipal boundaries, but also about the reality, I think, that is going to persist in upstate New York, which is demographic decline, necessitating us to visit the uncomfortable question that nobody in my fellow union members wants to talk about. I'm a proud union person. They don't want to talk about consolidation. They don't want to talk about municipal restructuring. They don't want to talk about that level of discomfort. And it's a problem that stretches all across the United States, from the Brookings Institution to up in Buffalo. Folks would rather think in terms of growth, and they'd rather think in terms of staying within the boxes that exist rather than addressing demographic decline and maybe changing the boundaries of the boxes. But I think we need to.
Thank you. I think we'll take maybe a couple other comments before we ask the panel to respond. And if you're more of a past or less of a past, please line yourself up in order, and please do come forward to the mics. Why don't you just come to the mics, because I think we need to use the mics, and we have. Okay. No more than 5 minutes. Okay, so we're asking you to be very brief, in other words.
Hi, my name's Lou Hemleski. I'm with CSEA. I just have a brief question about the whole premise here. Are we assuming that 30 years of Reaganomics have succeeded and that the federal government has no role in improving revenue sharing to communities in terms of infrastructure, maintenance? Is that just, maybe my question is naive, but is that just the assumption that this program, that there's nothing we can do about the federal government and revenue sharing and the decline in the last 30 years or so of that, and that we're just left to kind of pick over the crumbs in our fiscal stress?
Panelists, remember 2 questions so far. One of them is basically about the unit consolidation, and the other one then is about the role of the federal government in this whole issue area. And the last question?
Yeah, I just wanted to make a very quick observation. Even in upstate New York, it's sort of a bimodal effect. You have growth, particularly in urban cores. Some of it's refugee and immigrant driven. In the Mohawk Valley cities, Utica is trying to cope with an exploding population of new Americans. Some of the old upstate core metro cities have rebounded in terms of they've stabilized their enrollment. Now they have growth. But it's also true that we have demographic decline, but it's very mixed, and it's mixed by the type of community. And those communities that have growth with more challenging populations to serve need solutions, or you'll get a big mission gap or the educational insolvency. The other thing is there are economies of scale and there's diseconomies of scale. And we've seen that some mergers do not produce savings because they may have been too sparsely populated and you're creating too large a geographic area, and these savings do not materialize. So I think it's very important. Part of consolidation or sharing should be how to address the mission gap that you've already outlined. How do you create opportunity that's otherwise lost in terms of educational or local government services?
So I think one of the important things you're pointing out is the unevenness of both the circumstances of governments and therefore implicitly, if not explicitly, the unevenness of needed responses. And I wonder if any of our panelists want to respond to any of those 3? John, do you want to come up too? As a possible responder?
Go ahead.
Anybody over here?
I could talk a little bit about mergers. I think the fault in mergers is that we paint it with too broad of a brush. My leadership from NICOM is sitting in the room now, and they've done a very good study in the amount of consolidations that have actually taken place. From a local's perspective, I will never merge my police department with my sheriff's department. But that doesn't mean we can't find ways to operate behind the lines. But to talk, if I ever tried to get on the podium and said, let's eliminate our police department, the train will run south and I'll be on it. But that doesn't mean I cannot talk about consolidating some of the functions of a police department. Same thing with your fire department. Okay. Will I ever survive if I sat on a podium and said, let's go to a county-wide fire department? Probably not. Meaning that when we talk about consolidations, I think we need to change the conversations from merging towns and villages, villages and towns, cities and towns, cities and villages, to look at what we can do on a much smaller scale to get the same cost benefits. That's my thoughts on mergers and consolidations.
Just real quick, the one thing that we try to keep pushing different groups to talk about with mergers is a much more enriched conversation, and the very narrow conversation about the dollars. I think it's pretty clear that the dollars are not, we're not going to save a lot of dollars by these mergers, and all the easy mergers are done. So what's often not included in the conversation is the quality of the program at play. Now, not to say that you should merge, but to have that be a legitimate part of the conversation of what are the opportunities available for kids when you merge versus when you don't merge, and have that be part of the conversation. Lastly, with the federal role, I think just with the school part of it, the federal role is so small in terms of dollars. You know, it's 7, 8, 9% of any budget, which is still 7, 8, 9%, but I think there's no chance we're going to see 15%, 20% of a budget that the feds are going to be filling in. So I think in answer to the question, with the schools at least, I wouldn't look to the feds for much help.
Unfortunately, we need to cut the formal discussion off, but one of the reasons we built in breaks is because we really value both taking a break generally, but also giving opportunities for informal discussions. So we hope that during the, sorry? And the break, yeah, some of these themes will, of course, be picked up in detail in the breakout sessions later today. So we encourage you, I think, to go to the ones that you're most interested in and enjoy your break for the moment. Thank you.